Imagine that you're playing a game of blindfold chess and your opponent moves his knight but doesn't tell you which knight or where he moved it. Now, you have to make the correct move or else you will walk straight into checkmate. This is essentially what happened to the pilots of this flight, where imprecise communication and cognitive biases put them into a position of extreme danger. Stay tuned.
Terrain. Pull up.
Back in 1980, a relatively little-known airline called Inex-Adria Airways placed an order on 3 brand new MD-81s, which were McDonnell Douglas's updated version of the old DC-9. Inex-Adria Airways was the de facto flag carrier of what was then the Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia, and it would also remain so after Slovenia's independence. Back then, Inex-Adria had an all DC-9 fleet, so these MD-80s were a logical upgrade. It would require minimal new training for the company's existing DC-9 rated pilots, and the extra capacity gave the company a leg up in the holiday charter market, which is where they made most of their money. In the fall of 1981, Inex-Adria partnered with a Slovenian travel agency called Compass, and they signed a contract to take 130 passengers on a one-day return trip from the Slovenian capital Ljubljana over to the city of Ajaccio in the French Mediterranean island of Corsica. The passengers would then get the chance to spend a day sightseeing on the island before flying back home on that very same evening. Now, Inex-Adria had originally planned to use one of their older DC-9 aircraft for this trip, but after the new aircraft were delivered, they decided to instead switch over to one of these new, larger MD-81s and fill the extra seats with their employees and families as a sort of special treat. So, on December the 2nd, the day of the trip, the crew and passengers gathered early in the morning at Brnik Airport in Ljubljana and soon boarded their 5-month-old MD-81, which had accumulated only 683 flight hours at that point. Now, the crew that was going to operate this flight consisted of 2 pilots, 4 cabin crew, and a mechanic who would follow in case there would be any need for technical support during the day. The captain was a 55-year-old former Yugoslav Air Force pilot who had flown over 12,000 hours in total. Of those, only 188 had actually been flown in the MD-80 series, but he had over 9,000 hours on the very similar DC-9, so there was no question that he was very familiar with the aircraft. The first officer, who was going to be pilot flying for the first flight, was 40 years old and had 4,200 hours of total experience, including 288 on the MD-80 series. He had learned to fly at a local flying club and had then operated several general aviation aircraft in Yugoslavia before finally joining Inex-Adria. He had then been trained to fly on the MD-80 during the summer of 1980, but since these new aircraft wouldn't be delivered until almost a year later, he had only recently started flying it. But he had also been operating the DC-9 in the meantime, and whilst doing that, his performance had been praised by his instructors. So these were 2 skilled pilots, but as we will soon see, flight experience and skill will have very little to do with the outcome of this story. Anyway, the boarding process was probably a little bit hectic, because in addition to the 7 crew, there were also a full 173 passengers booked on the flight, which was actually more than the number of seats available. Even after putting the mechanic in the cockpit and some off-duty flight attendants on the spare jump seats, the only way that they could fit so many people into the aircraft was if children under the age of 13 were seated 2 per seat, which likely wasn't very comfortable nor safe. Now, one of the children on board was actually the first officer's own son, and he was invited to sit in the cockpit on the second jump seat, something that would have been perfectly legal at that time. Anyway, despite taking more passengers than the plane really had room for, the weight and balance wasn't an issue, since this was a return day trip, so the passengers had no baggage, and as I mentioned before, several of them were also children. So, after resolving a very minor electrical issue, the pilots finally completed their pre-flight preparation, and the aircraft took off from Ljubljana at 06:37 UTC, operating as flight JP1308 bound for Ajaccio. Now, before we get into the flight itself, let's look at a thing or two about the destination that they were now heading towards, because this was in no means a routine operation. The island of Corsica is almost totally covered by mountains, rising sharply out of the Mediterranean Sea. This makes for potentially very rough flying conditions, especially when the winds are strong, and the weather also has a tendency to change very quickly. On top of that, historically, the infrastructure of Ajaccio airport had not always been great. It was located on the west coast of the island with only one active runway, 0321. And whilst runway 03 was equipped with an instrument landing system, runway 21 was not, because of high terrain in the approach area. This meant that normally the only way to land on runway 21 was to first follow the runway 03 ILS down to a circling minima and then circle around to the other side visually if the conditions permitted. On top of that, the air traffic control tower at Ajaccio was not equipped with radar, and there was also some aspects of the approach procedure which were, well, a little bit more complex than usual, which I will explain in a lot more detail soon. Anyway, as a result of these shortcomings, the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, which is an umbrella group representing several pilot unions from around the world, had designated Ajaccio as deficient and had therefore warned its members to exercise caution when flying there. Now, we don't know how much the pilots of flight JP1308 really knew about these issues, because this was the first time that Inex-Adria Airways had ever operated into this airport, but that brings me to another really important point. You see, whenever we pilots fly to a new airport for the first time, and especially a less well-known airport with limited services like Ajaccio, it's super important that we take the time to research the procedures and facilities in detail before the flight. We do that so that we know exactly what we're getting into, and so we're properly prepared for the kinds of maneuvers that we might be asked to fly. In most cases, the planning departments at the airline will outline a special brief for the pilots to study, but if that's not done, well, then there are plenty of approach plates, low-level charts and ICAO documentation to access to do that ourselves. This forms part of the piloting command's duties, so ideally nothing about the descent, approach and landing procedures should come as a surprise once the flight actually starts. In any case, we don't really know the extent of the pilot's preparations for this flight, because the cockpit voice recorder only captured the last 30 minutes, meaning that the pre-flight briefings were lost. But there is reason to believe that the crew maybe wasn't as prepared as they should be when the flight started, which we will very soon see. But when we're on the topic of preparation, I want to first tell you about something deeply personal to me. As many of you might know, I have recently moved with my family to a new country, and dealing with all of the stresses of that, setting up a new company and still being there for my kids and wife has been a real challenge. Those types of upticks in stress is something that we all face from time to time, and I'm a real believer in trying to find tools that help make those situations easier. Today's sponsor, BetterHelp, is exactly such a tool, and through them, my therapist gave me great tips on how to approach these challenges, maximize my workflow while still keeping my spirits reasonably high. BetterHelp is an online-based platform, and that fact makes initial contact with therapy super easy and convenient. You just sign up, fill in a short questionnaire, and then you'll be matched with a licensed professional, usually within 48 hours or so. After that, you can communicate with your therapist through phone, messaging, or my favorite, video calls, which makes it super flexible since you can basically choose whatever location suits you best to do it. I view therapy like going to the gym for the mind, and it's truly something that everyone should try out for themselves. And if you're interested, go to betterhelp.com/mentorpilot. That will give you a 10% discount on your first month of therapy, and I highly recommend it. Thank you, BetterHelp. Now let's see what happened on this flight. The climb and cruise phases of this flight were pretty uneventful, with the aircraft soaring through very nice weather as it passed overhead Italy. But there was quite a lot going on in the cockpit, since in addition to routine communications with air traffic control, the cockpit door was also open, and the CVR captured several passengers asking the pilots various technical questions about the airplane. These distractions then continued as they were getting closer to the destination, and the pilots soon also got the weather and started discussing reports of a tailwind for runway 03. Since that was the only runway with an ILS, this made them suspect that they might have to do a circuit to land over to runway 21 instead of landing runway 03. Now, a circling is a relatively complicated maneuver compared to a standard straight-in landing. It involves descending down to a relatively low altitude and then break off to either left or right and maneuver visually for a landing from the opposite side. This obviously requires good crew coordination and strict adherence to procedures, and therefore it also requires a detailed brief from the pilot flying. The only reported clouds at Ajaccio were some high cirrus at 30,000 feet, so the weather was good enough for this maneuver. But as I mentioned before, mountainous islands like Corsica can quickly create their own weather. And as it turns out, even though the conditions were reported as clear over the airport, the interior mountains were actually already covered by dense fog. At 08:31 local time, Flight 1308 received clearance from the Rome sector to begin their initial descent from flight level 330. As they started descending, the captain asked the first officer to calculate their landing data, and once that was done, the first officer then continued with his approach briefing, where he should have discussed every aspect of the approach, including the required speeds, minimum altitudes, navigational aids, and so on. Now, I want to point out here that ideally the approach briefing should be completed before the aircraft starts descending. We do that in order to minimize the effects of any disruptions which might occur as the workload increases during the descent. And this is especially important when the approach is complicated or unfamiliar. And in this case, we know that the procedure that they were now about to fly was both of those things. So before we continue into the critical part of this story, I want to first walk us through the entire instrument approach procedure they were now about to fly, because the details are soon going to become very important. For an ILS approach into runway 03, followed in this case by a circling approach, the approach procedure began from a VOR beacon called Alpha Juliet Oscar, Ajaccio, located 10 nautical miles south of Ajaccio Airport. A VOR beacon is a type of basic navigational aid that emits directional signals called radials, who allow an aircraft's VOR instruments to display the magnetic bearing from the VOR. So, if you're flying directly away from the VOR on a track of 300 degrees, then we would say that you're tracking the 300-degree outbound radial from that VOR. And you can also track inbound on that same radial towards the beacon, but let's not make things more complicated than it needs to be right now. Anyway, the idea was that after reaching the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR, the aircraft should then normally enter a left-hand racetrack-shaped holding pattern from the VOR in order to lose some altitude. After that descent was then complete, the aircraft should then leave the VOR, following the 247-degree radial outbound, heading southwest for 8 nautical miles. After that, the procedure called for a left-hand course reversal, looping back more than 180 degrees to intercept the ILS localizer and glide slope, which would then guide the airplane down towards the runway. And this would then be followed by a possible visual circling, as I discussed before. Now, I want to point out here that this is a relatively complicated approach. Most ILS approaches are more straightforward than this, but to really understand this procedure, we also have to look at the minimum altitudes and speeds associated with each phase of this procedure. You see, due to the high mountains in the area, the minimum altitude over the Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR was set to 6,800 feet, meaning that this was also the lowest altitude an aircraft could descend to in the holding pattern. After leaving the VOR on radial 247, a further descent was then permitted down to 3,300 feet, followed by an unrestricted descent to the minima after the localizer and glide slope was captured. Now, I want to return back to the holding pattern for a while, because it's going to become super important for this story. You see, these kind of procedural holding patterns are designed so that their minimum altitude provides a healthy margin above any terrain within a certain defined area around the pattern, referred to as the protected area. The size of that protected area is based on the distance that would be covered by an aircraft flying at a maximum allowed speed, assuming 1-minute legs, plus some quite generous margins for error. I should note that 1-minute legs for holding patterns is pretty much the global standard at lower altitudes, and we normally measure that timing using a standard stopwatch in order to decide when it's time to turn around at each end of the racetrack pattern, adjusted for wind. More modern holdings are defined by distances from the nav aid, but that was not the case here. The maximum indicated speed for this holding was 210 knots, which brought the protected area out far enough to overfly a 4,500-foot high mountain called San Pietro. That's why the minimum safe altitude in the pattern had been set to 6,800 feet. But the depiction of the holding pattern on the Jeppesen approach plates used by this crew didn't actually show the full size of the protected area. Instead, it showed a pattern resembling the track of an aircraft flying at only 150 knots, and that fact was not indicated anywhere on the chart. An airplane traveling at 150 knots wouldn't fly anywhere near Mount San Pietro, and the highest terrain near the depicted racetrack was only about 2,500 feet. So, it wouldn't have been obvious at a glance why the minimum altitude in the holding was so high. Mount San Pietro was almost off the edge of the chart, just squeezing in at the right-hand side, and that likely made it much harder to see just how dangerous it would be to descend lower than the depicted minimum altitude in the pattern. Remember that. Anyway, Back on board flight JP1308, the pilots had now started discussing the speeds they would use at each phase of the approach. But as they were doing so, they were interrupted by a flight attendant asking to turn down the cabin temperature, and also by some comments from the first officer's son, who was still seated in the cockpit. After that, a lengthy exchange with the air traffic controller then took place, where they received clearance to descend further down to flight level 110, and this conversation prompted the captain to make some comments about how he felt the controller wasn't using proper phraseology, which will soon become sadly ironic. Anyway, after this, the pilots resumed their approach briefing, where they mentioned the courses they would fly, the altitude for intercepting the ILS, the decision height, the missed approach procedure, as well as some other smaller items. And during this briefing, the first officer's young son again interrupted them twice, once to ask whether they were going down yet, and a second time to point out a mountain that he thought resembled the Matterhorn. Now, these interruptions weren't ideal, and it actually is a quite good example of why it's not a good idea to allow any non-operating people into the cockpit during critical phases of flight. But back in those days when this was allowed, I actually took quite a few friends and family on the jump seat as well, and it only really took a simple briefing to make sure that they were quiet during those phases, and I kind of miss those days actually. Anyway, the cockpit voice recorder on this flight had a really poor quality, so not all parts of the briefings were easy to hear, but two things that were definitely not heard was any discussion about the minimum altitude of 6,800 feet in the hold or the maximum holding speed of 210 knots. We don't know for sure why these items were not mentioned. Maybe the generally good weather in the area lulled the crew into some false sense of security. But I do want to take this opportunity to point out that briefing and verifying these types of restrictions is absolutely critical, especially when operating around areas of high terrain. In any case, the pilots then moved on to tune their navigational radios to receive the ILS and to set up their radio altimeters, after which the captain reported to ATC that they were now 28 miles away from the VOR, level at 11,000 feet. Still, even after this, some further elements of the approach briefing were mentioned, such as the location of the final turnback maneuver at 8 miles from the VOR and the timings of the holding pattern, which were again interspersed with unintelligible statements and comments from the first officer's son. While still maintaining 11,000 feet, flight JP1308 was then handed over to the Ajaccio approach controller. And it is here where this otherwise pretty uneventful flight really started to take a turn for the worse. At time 08:47 am, the captain called up Ajaccio approach to report the decision and request further descent. And that means that we now need to introduce a new character, the approach controller, who will end up playing a key role in this story. The controller was 24 years old and had been working at Ajaccio Airport since July 1980. But on this day, he had only been qualified for the approach control position for less than 1 month, and there was no supervisor on duty. The only other person helping him was an assistant controller with 1 year of experience at Ajaccio, and his main job was just to answer the telephone. So it was therefore this young, inexperienced controller who now received Flight 1308's position report, and he quickly replied, "Ajaccio approach, good morning. Number 1 in approach, you maintain flight level 110 until you reach Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. It will be for an approach from the VOR. QNH 1009, QFE 1008, surface wind is 280 degrees for 20 knots. Runway 21 in use, you report over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR, and then descending over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR." Now, let's pick apart what this transmission was saying, because this was an absolutely pivotal moment in this story. The first instruction was obviously to continue in level flight until reaching the VOR, so that was pretty unambiguous. But what did the controller mean by "it will be for a procedure from the VOR"? Well, according to his testimony later on, the controller apparently intended to clear flight 1308 for approach from that point. So let's go over what that actually meant. When as a pilot I hear the words "cleared for approach," I know that this means that I can fly the procedure described on my approach chart from the initial fix all the way down to the point where the tower gives me landing clearance without having to request any further specific permissions to descend. And it made sense for the controller to clear flight 1308 for approach at this point, since they were number 1 to land with no other traffic anywhere nearby. But in this case, the controller didn't use the words "cleared for approach." Actually, what he said was it will be for a procedure from the VOR, which in my view doesn't convey the same meaning at all. In fact, if I hear those words, my interpretation would be that the controller couldn't clear me for the approach yet and was just making me aware that I would be cleared for that type of approach at a later point. So, not surprisingly, that's also how the pilots of Flight 1308 interpreted this transmission, which meant that, as far as they were concerned, until the words "cleared for approach" were used, they would need to request permission for any further descent. As a result of this, a misunderstanding now developed, where the controller believed that Flight 1308 was free to descend at their own discretion, but the pilots believed that they would need further clearances. And this brings me to a really key point that I want to make about this whole exchange. Clear communication is absolutely key for the safe operation of any aircraft, but communication over radio comes with a very high risk of misinterpretation. When we as humans interact with each other, the majority of the communication is actually non-verbal, transmitted through facial expressions, body language, gestures, tone of voice, and so on. But when you have a pilot speaking to a controller who they can't physically see, and on top of that they're communicating in English, of which neither is a native speaker, then the only way to ensure that the other party receives the true intent of one's statement is to use very clear and specific terminology that is common to everyone involved. This is why in aviation today we have a highly controlled set of standardized terms and phrases common to both pilots and air traffic controllers, which are defined by the International Civil Aviation Organization and in use all around the world. But back in 1981, ICAO had not yet published its first universal phraseology handbook, so it was not uncommon for controllers and pilots from different countries to have slightly different conceptions of what would be acceptable terminology. And what we're soon about to see is one of the very reasons why that phraseology handbook was eventually written, and why it's so important that every pilot and controller adheres to it as closely as possible. The captain listened to the controller's slightly confusing transmission and then replied with his own interpretation of it. Roger sir, that means we are maintaining 110 until Ajaccio VOR. In holding pattern, we have to descend. At the moment, maintaining 110, runway 21 in use, wind is from 180, 20 knots, QNH 1009. Now here he correctly read back the runway in use, the altimeter setting and the instructions to remain at flight level 110 until the VOR, but he also incorrectly read back the wind and added that he would need to descend in the holding pattern, which appears to be a hint that he was expecting a further clearance to do so. And that should have alerted the controller that the flight was not about to start the approach. But in the readback, apart from correcting the wind, the controller simply confirmed the readback and didn't add any new information about any further clearances because, as far as he was concerned, he had already cleared the flight for approach and they were therefore free to descend according to the published procedures. 1 minute later, at time 0849, flight 1308 started approaching the VOR and the captain reported, "Just now Ajaccio VOR, level is 110 in holding pattern." And since the purpose of the holding pattern was to descend, he was now expecting a further descent clearance. But instead, the controller said, "Roger 1308, report leaving Alpha Juliet Oscar on radial 247 for final approach." He believed that flight 1308 was just making a routine position report, so he just told them what the next reporting point was. Remember, Ajaccio Airport didn't have radar, so these position reports were the only way for him to know where the airplane actually was. But this wasn't what the captain wanted to hear, so he said, "Okay, we are just over Ajaccio VOR and are requesting further descent." And it was at this point that a second, even more significant misunderstanding now occurred. The controller didn't really know why flight 1308 was requesting further descent when, in his view, they had already been cleared for the approach, so he probably started trying to imagine what the flight crew's intention with this call was. Now, in his experience, most flights approaching Ajaccio didn't bother with the holding pattern. They simply descended steeply on the 247-degree radial outbound from the VOR in order to get down to the ILS intercept altitude without having to hold. But that was a local procedure for pilots familiar with the airport and not what was shown on the actual approach charts. And remember, this was the first time that this crew was flying into Ajaccio, so they had no way of knowing about this local procedure. But from the controller's perspective, Flight 1308 had reported reaching the VOR, then he had asked them to report leaving the VOR on radial 247, and the captain had immediately replied, "We are just over Ajaccio VOR, requesting further descent," all of which appeared to resemble the sequence of transmissions that he would expect from an aircraft that was skipping the holding pattern and turning directly out onto radial 247. Now, by this point, Flight 1308 had twice mentioned their intention to enter the holding, but the controller was likely suffering from some expectation bias here, where he expected the flight to behave in the same way as most other flights did, and his brain therefore started to deprioritize evidence which contradicted this. Now, I want to emphasize here that it's really dangerous to just assume that an aircraft is going to fly a non-standard procedure without very explicit confirmation of this, but that is still what happened here. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you aren't sure about the intentions of the person you're communicating with, then just asking and confirming it clearly will erase 99% of all misunderstandings, even if it might feel and sound a little bit awkward. Anyway, as a result of this, and likely to try and help the pilots out, the controller now said, 1308, you're clear to descend 3000 and QNH 1009 on the radial 247, Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR, and report leaving Alpha Juliet Oscar. His intention here was to comply with Flight 1308's request for further descent by giving them the minimum altitude for the Ajaccio 247 outbound radial segment, which was also the segment he had asked them to report. But due to poor transmission quality, it sounded like he said 3,000 feet instead of 3,300 feet. The reason he added report leaving Alpha Juliet Oscar was presumably also to allow the crew to confirm that they were actually leaving the VOR instead of holding. But the pilots of Flight 1308 instead interpreted this as their clearance to descend in the hold, since that was the response that they were expecting. Now, the controller did use the words on radial 247, which in theory should mean that the descent to 3,000 feet should take place on that radial, but that was likely not how the flight crew saw it. According to the final report, there had been previous cases in France where crews from Yugoslavia had interpreted the clearance to descend in a route segment as an order to descend to the specified altitude before entering that segment, which was of course incorrect and sometimes resulted in violations of minimum altitudes. If that was the case here, then the controller's wording would have only reinforced the pilot's expectation that they were being cleared to descend to 3,000 feet in the holding pattern before entering the 247 radial. But do you remember what the minimum altitude in the holding pattern was? Yeah, 6,800 feet, a number that the pilots had not reviewed during their approach briefing. And furthermore, many Yugoslavian pilots later told investigators that in their country, air traffic controllers would take into account the terrain in their clearances even if radar guidance was not being provided. But in France and most other countries, separation from terrain in a non-radar environment is the sole responsibility of the pilot. Also, remember how the Jeppesen chart depicted the holding pattern as a small racetrack overflying relatively low terrain, not higher than 2,500 feet, even though the actual protected area overflow a 4,500 feet high mountain? Well, all of these factors now came together to cause the flight crew to become immediately and completely convinced not only that they had been cleared to descend to 3,000 feet in the holding pattern, but also that it would be completely safe to do so. As a result, the captain now read back, "Roger, will do. We're leaving 11 for 3,000, radial 247, out of 110. And he then asked for the controller to repeat the altimeter setting, which he also did. Now, to the controller, this transmission sounded very much like Flight 1308 was descending to 3,000 feet on radial 247, just as he wanted. But what the captain actually meant was that we're leaving 11 for 3,000 feet and will report radial 247. This is yet another great example of how radio communications has to be super specific. It just wasn't clear from this message whether radial 247 in this case meant the current or future position of the airplane. However, the first officer now made some kind of comment about this, and the captain might have realized that his transmission was a bit ambiguous, so he called back and added, "We're holding over Ajaccio. Call you inbound on radial 247. This should have definitely caused the controller to realize that Flight 1308 was actually entering the holding pattern, because there isn't really any other way to interpret that sentence, but because the controller had already mentally placed Flight 1308 on the 247 radial, the meaning of the transmission just didn't compute, and he simply replied, "Roger." The aircraft now entered the holding pattern, and to understand what happened next, we also briefly need to go over how the pilots had configured their aircraft for this descent. When they finally received their descent clearance, the pilots selected the autopilot's vertical speed mode, and in this mode the autopilot would control the pitch to maintain a descent rate selected by the crew from the autopilot control panel. And in this case, we know that they selected minus 2,200 feet per minute. It was later shown that this rate would almost perfectly result in the aircraft arriving at Ajaccio at 3,000 feet before leaving on radial 247, but we don't know whether this was an intentional selection or just a coincidence. The final report doesn't clearly state what mode the auto throttle was in or whether the crew had selected a target airspeed, but what we do know is that the engines were pinned at idle from the very start of the descent. Now, even with the engines at idle, since the aircraft was in a clean configuration with no flaps or speed brakes being used, the 2,200 feet per minute descent rate meant a rather high airspeed. Crossing the VOR, the speed was 285 knots, which then fell briefly back to 224 before increasing back to 256 knots again. That's slightly above the normal 250 knot speed limit below 10,000 feet, but well above the 210 knot speed limit for the holding pattern, which again the pilots hadn't reviewed during their approach briefing. And to make things even worse, as they were now flying outbound, they also encountered a tailwind, later calculated to have been around 65 knots, which further increased their ground speed. As I mentioned earlier, the protected area of the holding pattern was big enough to account for a rather large speed error, but Flight 1308 was now pushing those boundaries to their very limits, as their speed caused them to fly a both wider and longer pattern. The pilots had no idea that with this speed that they were now traveling, they would be on course to overflying Mount San Pietro, which, remember, was that 4,500 feet high mountain at the very edge of their charge. And they were now doing that while actively descending down towards 3,000 feet. This meant that from this moment, 2 minutes now remained in which the pilots still had a chance to avert disaster. As Flight 1308 began the outbound leg of the holding pattern, the first officer also started timing for 1 minute. As the descent continued, the pilots then extended the flaps and slat to start slowing the aircraft down, and during the outbound leg, some unintelligible conversations occurred and the first officer's son again asked something, but there was no sign that the pilots felt in any way uneasy about the situation. However, as they proceeded outbound, they suddenly found themselves leaving the beautiful, clear conditions along the coastline and instead passing into an area of dense clouds, which was covering Corsica's mountainous interior. Shortly after this, they also came to the end of their timing for the outbound leg and therefore started turning left back towards the VOR, but something now seemed to have started to bother the captain. At time 08:52 and 15 seconds, he made a call to air traffic control where he said, "We're rolling inbound out of 6,000. This wasn't a routine position report, since we normally don't need to tell air traffic control when we're turning inbound, so to me it seems likely that the captain made this call because he wanted to make sure that the controller knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. Now in France, the typical terminology used for making this type of position report would have been turning inbound, whereas the Yugoslavian captain had said rolling inbound, which the controller just didn't really understand. So in response, he just responded, "Roger, 1308, report turning inbound." Realizing that the controller hadn't properly understood him, the captain responded, "Turning inbound to Ajaccio, because at the moment we are in cloud." Unfortunately, that statement once again included imprecise terminology, which just made the controller's confusion worse. You see, when the captain said turning inbound to Ajaccio, that could mean one of two things. Either the Ajaccio VOR, Alpha Juliet Oscar, or the Ajaccio airport itself. Because the controller thought that the flight had already passed the VOR, he now thought that turning inbound to Ajaccio meant that the flight was now turning to final in order to intercept the ILS, which would indeed make sense to him. As a result, he didn't realize that Flight 1308 was actually still in the holding pattern and now descending well below the minimum altitude there. The controller responded, "Roger, 1308, Charlie Tango, report on final, surface wind 280 degrees, 20 knots." Charlie Tango was another nav aid situated on final approach, where the approach controller would normally hand the aircraft over to the tower controller for landing clearance. Now, understandably, the flight crew found this instruction rather confusing. They hadn't even reported leaving the hold, even less entering the 247 radial, so the cockpit voice recorder now picked up some conversations about this, as the pilots tried to figure out where Charlie Tango was located, and this also meant that they didn't immediately respond to the air traffic controller. Flight 1308 was now continuing in a left turn with a bank angle of 25 degrees, and they were now also encountering increasingly heavy turbulence, which caused the airspeed and vertical acceleration to fluctuate significantly. Now, the terrifying truth was that this turbulence was most likely caused by the strong winds passing over mountaintops ahead of them, hidden by the dense clouds. You see, when flying near mountains, especially in windy conditions like this, you can sometimes encounter severe turbulence as well as powerful downdrafts that comes in the form of rotors on the downwind side of the mountains. Those downdrafts can be strong enough to push a low-flying airplane down towards the terrain below, and this was precisely why the minimum altitude in the hold had been set to 6,800 feet, which was a full 2,300 feet above the top of the highest mountain. But obviously, the greatest danger still came from the terrain itself, as Flight 1308 was soon about to discover. Just after the crew had finally found Charlie Tango on their chart, at time 08:53 and 8 seconds, the ground proximity warning system suddenly activated, calling out, "Terrain, terrain, terrain." And at almost exactly the same moment, the controller also called the flight up and said, "It will be as you want, left-hand circuit runway 21 or right-hand circuit." Now, this sudden burst of noise as this transmission overlapped with the GPWS warning would have been extremely startling and disorienting for the flight crew, and it now took them several seconds to figure out what was actually going on. So much must have been going through their heads at that moment, as they were now trying to parse these multiple oral inputs and understand why the terrain alarm was suddenly sounding. Had they made some kind of mistake, and if so, what was it? After a further couple of seconds of this confusion, the GPWS warning changed over to pull up, and now the first officer finally began to slowly add power and raise the nose. Now, he did so as if he wasn't quite sure about what was going on, but still wanted to follow the confusing GPWS warning just in case. But the flight data recorder showed that even though he was now pitching up, the airplane actually kept descending at about the same rate as it had before, which meant that it was now dropping closer and closer to the terrain. This was because Flight 1308 was now in the direct shadow of the mountain and was therefore being affected by a strong downdraft with a vertical speed as high as 2,300 feet per minute. In order to escape this downdraft and enter a climb, the pilots needed to aggressively pitch up and apply maximum power, but unfortunately that wasn't happening. As the GPWS continued to sound, the captain now saw that they were still descending, so he called out "Power!" and then pushed the thrust levers fully forward. But it was already too late. At time 08:53 and 21 seconds, the MD-81 collided with Mount San Pietro, whilst still in a left bank, causing the left wingtip to strike several boulders protruding from the summit ridge. The impact was so powerful that it overturned a boulder measuring 8 cubic meters, and that impact severed half of the left wing, rendering the airplane completely uncontrollable. For 7 more seconds, the airplane then continued to fly over the top of the mountain while rolling rapidly to the left until it finally collided head-on with a rock outcropping about 700 meters below the summit. This final impact completely destroyed the aircraft, scattering debris over an area measuring half a square kilometer, and tragically, all 180 souls on board were instantly lost. In the tower, at the exact moment of the accident, the controller heard a strange whistling sound over the radio, but when he tried to call back, Flight 1308 just didn't respond. A search and rescue mission was quickly launched, and about 5 hours after the accident, the wreckage was found in a steep ravine on the side of Mount San Pietro. The crash site was so difficult to access that a lot of the wreckage actually ended up being left there for over 25 years, and the investigators had a lot of trouble even finding anything that they could use. But With the help of the black boxes, which were thankfully found, the French investigation determined that the primary cause of this accident was the pilot's descent below the minimum altitude in the holding pattern, which led to the collision with the terrain. Investigators from Yugoslavia felt that this was just way too reductive. In an appendix to the final report, the Yugoslavians wrote that an additional cause of the crash was the misunderstanding between the pilots and the controller, which led the pilots to believe that a descent to 3,000 feet was safe. This misunderstanding was caused by both sides' use of non-standard terminology, and I actually agree that this was likely the real root cause of the crash. The investigation also solicited input from a wide range of interest groups to see what they thought caused the accident and what they thought should be done about it. Most of these groups pointed out one obvious issue. Why exactly was the holding pattern located over the mountains and not over the perfectly flat sea next to it? The consensus on this point was so extensive that the procedure was actually changed, and today the approach for Ajaccio is much simpler, containing a holding pattern well away from the terrain. The crash also resulted in Ajaccio Airport finally being fitted with radar. But looking back at this over 40 years later, it's really clear how a number of other procedures that we use today could have prevented this accident from happening. With properly standardized terminology, it's very unlikely that the controller would have said anything other than cleared for approach after the first contact with the flight, and all further misunderstandings would then have been avoided. But there is also another rather heartbreaking fact. You see, pilots today train in the simulator to perform something that we call a terrain escape maneuver. This drills into us that as soon as we hear a GPWS hard warning, we should immediately and without question apply max thrust, roll wings level, retract the speed brake and pitch up to 20 degrees and then as much as needed up to and including intermittent stick shaker. If the pilots of Flight 1308 had been trained to fly this modern terrain escape maneuver, it's very possible that they would have been able to overcome the mountain downdraft, and this video would have never needed to be made. Even with the limited actions that the pilots actually took, the airplane nearly cleared the mountaintop, merely striking a protruding boulder with its lower left wing as they were passing over the ridge. So if they would have been just a few feet higher, everyone on board would have probably survived. Unnecessary tragedies like this one happened all too often in the 1970s and 80s, but it's also because of them that aviation is as incredibly safe as it is today. Now, if you want to discuss this or some other incident or something else directly with me, I really recommend you to join my fantastic Patreon crew using the link below in the description or here on the screen. I do regular Zoom hangouts with my patrons where we discuss anything and everything, and it's usually really nice, so I hope to see you there next time as well. You can also support me by sending a super thanks or buying some cool merch. Everything is really appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.